Early age. At 5 years old, I was very ill and I had a near-death experience. And at that time, my memory for the page, when there's going to be a great renaissance of spiritual understanding, the Merlin energy comes back.
Jeff and his friends run a healing group, touring the country, offering people in need of help a chance to share the magical experiences which brought them together.
We were working with the energy, and all of a sudden we saw a mist forming. And as we watched it very gradually and gently, a beautiful pink carnation eased its way out of the mist. And appeared, a real carnation appeared before us.
There was also a talk in Wimbledon once whereby Jeff basically gave one person healing and then people held hands all the way down the line and you could hear this sound rather like, in fact it was rather like an engine sort of going shoo, shoo.
In 1993, Jeff claims to have retrieved Excalibur, a sword-shaped crystal about 8 inches long, which he and his followers used to connect with another dimension.
There was actually a round table in Merlin's time. We're going to rebuild it. I know the pattern in my mind. It's not just a table, it has particular patterns on it. And what I call Merlin's stone, the Excalibur, which resembles the sword, fits into the middle of this table and actually sets up what I can only describe as a dimensional energy, a way of opening up the other dimensions to come through.
Until the proper round table is completed, Jeff feels that it would be inappropriate to show Excalibur to anyone outside of his circle. However, historians believe there were no round tables or fairy tale castles at the time the original Merlin was supposed to have lived in the 5th century.
I am Merlin! The popular image of the days of Merlin and King Arthur is nothing like the reality. Well, here we are in a village of the 5th century, protected by a wooden palisade all the way round to keep wolves out and robbers, predators at night. And we've got our houses built here, nice round houses, wattle and daub under a heavy thatch roof to keep out the rain.
Based on new archaeological discoveries over the last 30 years, historians believe Dark Age Britain was far more civilised than previously thought. But although the ancient Britons probably kept records, none of the original stories of Merlin have survived.
Sadly, we don't altogether know why, most of what was written, and much must have been written, has vanished. Awfully little has survived, and probably it was a mixture of the usual depredations of bad, wet, damp weather we have in this country. But also, I'm sorry to say, our friends from Norway and Denmark, who came as rather rough and tough tourists in the 9th century onwards.
Although the knights in shining armour depicted in medieval stories never existed in the time of Merlin, Britain, besieged by invaders and split into warring kingdoms, was still a violent place.
This is the armour, really, of the 5th century warrior, a shield that is not only used to parry blows, but it's used to try and smack your enemy in the face with it if you can. Here we've got the ringmail shirt that should turn blows. This is the sort of sword that the 5th century warrior might carry. An iron bar, a pattern-welded blade meant to smash bones underneath armour. A hand-and-a-half sword like this, so you can get a tremendous grip of it and deliver a tremendous blow at your enemy. So these are the weapons then, the arms and equipment of the 5th century warrior.
The problem for historians has been that Geoffrey of Monmouth places Merlin in both the 5th century during the rule of Vortigern and in the 6th century at the time of Arthur, making him some 150 years old. To get round this problem, an Anglo-Welsh successor of his, Gerald of Wales, writing at the end of the 12th century, was the first to suggest that there were in fact 2 Merlins.
Geoffrey Wales ingeniously brought the two together by suggesting there must therefore have been two Merlins. But there wasn't really. It's clear there was one Merlin of Welsh tradition, and that this is just Geoffrey who confused it. But there certainly was a Merlin whom the Welsh knew long before Geoffrey.
And it was this Merlin, Merlin the Wild, that Geoffrey based his second book, The Life of Merlin, upon. This book appears to be much closer to the truth because some of the stories can be verified in Welsh poems recorded 200 years earlier in the 9th century.
Now, for this one, he'd obviously either done a bit of homework or he'd been told off by his Welsh friends, because this is far nearer the real Merlin of Welsh tradition, who lived actually at the end of the 6th century, that's to say about 150 years later than Vortigern, and he lived in North Britain, not in Wales, on the Scottish border.
In the year 573, Merlin the Wild, driven mad by the carnage of the Battle of Ardereth, fled here to Hartfell in Scotland.
According to the Welsh annals, a terrible battle was fought, famous later for its bloodthirstiness. And in this battle, Merlin's patron, King Gwendolen, was killed by rival British kings. And Merlin is said, it says in the Old Welsh annal, that Merlin became insane. And in the very early poetry, he's represented as going mad and retiring to the Caledonian forest, which is up in the Scottish lowlands. And there he uttered these lamentable prophecies in which he starts by bewailing his terrible condition, living with snow up to his waist among wolves, and lamenting the death of King Gwendolen. And then he prophesies.
As the bard to King Gwendolen, the last pagan king in Britain, Merlin had been responsible for the battle, advising him to go to war with King Druidic. According to the poems, in his resulting madness, he went to a particular spring to heal himself. Piecing together the clues hidden under centuries of myth and folklore, Count Nikolai Tolstoy was able to trace the location of the spring to a remote hillside 30 miles from Carlisle.
Well, this is the cave, I believe, that contains the spa, which by a magnificent bit of literary and historical detective work, Nikolai Tolstoy has made a good case to be Merlin's spring. Now, it doesn't look quite as it should, because the tidy-minded council have put a fence around it to try and keep the sheep out. I don't think very successfully. But if you go in, there is the most delicious, I think, iron-tasting clear water bubbling up there. No lovely maiden, unfortunately, which Merlin used to describe as having here. So we can't be certain about it, but it has a certain atmosphere inside.
Although everything we know of Merlin the Wild survives in ancient Welsh poems, he was in reality never located in Wales.
Merlin's people were the Cumbric people, what we call nowadays the Welsh-speaking. And they inhabited all these parts, and of course right in the south as well. But they were pushed out by the Anglo-Saxons on the east, and eventually on the west by the Scots, Irish and Norse. And so it wasn't until the 9th century that the stories of Merlin and of Arthur, they went south and were kept in Wales. And then they were rediscovered by Geoffrey of Monmouth centuries later. But it does seem as though the bards who sang about Merlin, that is Aneurin and Taliesin, that they came from these parts.
In these poems, which take the form of conversations, Merlin the Wild gives an insight into his pagan beliefs, which many historians have linked with Druidry, the indigenous religion of ancient Britain.
When he was up here in this very place with his friend Taliesin, and later joined by his sister Gwendid, the wife of King Rhydderch, he gives the finest account of the kind of things that Druids were really interested in. They were interested in the 4 levels of the cosmos and all the beings who lived in them, and of the sun and the stars, and of the birds and what birds meant. And this was certainly part of Druidic training, though of course Merlin is the most unusual Druid because he was also a fool of love. And he said, I'm madder than ever because I enjoy living here imprisoned by my wonderful maiden, who I think may have been his sister.
The incestuous connection between Merlin and his sister Gwendith, also known as Ganaida, is not clear. She may be the inspiration for Nimue and Vivian, who in later stories pursued Merlin for sexual and magical favours.
For a lot of people, the idea of a brother and sister spending time together in the wilderness meant only one thing, the possibility of incest. So that may well come into the story somehow, and that may also account for the later stories in which Merlin has a relationship with this mysterious witch-like woman, Nimue, probably a medieval idea of what was really going on.
However, the early references to Merlin's insanity could hide the origins of his prophetic visions.
The story of his going mad, I think, is simply a misunderstanding, and a rather precious misunderstanding, because it's often these mistakes which give one clues to the older story lying underneath. There's a tradition among shamans the world over, and these Welsh Druids were essentially, I think, practiced these shamanistic rites, where the man, before he prophesies, goes into an ecstatic fit, and then he speaks in strange garbled language, but it's really the god speaking through him, and when he recovers he can't remember what he said. And this account of his being mad, I think, simply refers to the prophetic frenzy which overtook him.
Merlin the Wild could have used similar rituals to those found in American Indian tribes to call upon the spirits of sacred animals and plants.
If we were able to look in on him right now, we might see him walking around a fire, we might see him calling in his spirit helpers in the 4 directions, we might see him beating out a rhythmical pattern with sticks or stones or bones, and we might see him looking into the fire. Any of these ways might have enabled him to trigger a kind of trance state in which he was able to move out of ordinary reality and into a more subtle place from where he could come back with information.
Though no one can be certain exactly which shamanic rites Merlin the Wild practiced, modern-day Druids believe they have rediscovered the essence of his ancient beliefs.
The Druid tradition is about the power of nature, and Merlin was making contact, deep connections with the power of nature, and that's the essence of modern Druidry, it's the essence of ancient Druidry, and that's where we connect with Merlin.
I am the lord of the wild wood, my brother wolves around me stand.
The animal who Merlin was associated with, which appeals to me most, is the wolf, because the wolf happens to be the animal that I work with most. Merlin, the experience that he went through after the Battle of Arthdelith, that drove him to insanity. And he, like me, found his own way of bringing himself back from the edge. I had at least the option of psychiatrists, which I actually didn't take up, but he didn't have that. He just had a wolf, a pig and an apple tree. But that's enough if you know how to work with them.
In the 9th century poems, many of the prophecies attributed to Merlin in his insanity take the form of a conversation with a pig.
I'm the wild man of the woods. The wolf, yes, the wolf, little piggy. The wolf is my companion.
So he's actually communicating with the spirits of animals, trees, and bringing through the spirit world in that way.
So where does the pig stop and Merlin start, eh? Brood on that. In your search for wisdom.
At the time these poems were set, St Kentigern, the patron saint of Glasgow, was busy converting the remaining pagans in the area to Christianity, and Merlin the Wild became a regular sight outside his monastery.
He made a nuisance of himself to St Kentigern and his monks, and he used to stand on a stone opposite their monastery, which was at Hoddam, between Loch Mabon and the Cloch Mabonstein, and shout at them. But eventually he got reconciled to Kentigern.
According to the story, recorded by the not altogether unbiased Christian monks, the pagan Merlin then decided he'd had enough of his heathen lifestyle and asked St Kentigern to baptise him.
This stone here is supposed to be where St Kentigern baptised the pagan Merlin, and where he also received communion.
Not far from the site of Merlin's baptism, in the church founded by St Kentigern at Stobo, a stained glass window commemorates the Christianisation of the last great pagan icon of Britain.
I think the window in the church, it's a good window, but it's only half the picture. I don't dispute that Merlin needed to become a Christian. That's in the story. I do dispute the later hagiographers who imply in that picture that good and kindness is on the side of Kentigern, savagery, peasantry, poverty, insanity is on the side of Merlin. It goes in with the story that Merlin was the son of the devil. You know, it all came later. It's ridiculous. It's propaganda for the church. Merlin and these early Celtic figures who have these gifts of nature, and we mix them with the gifts of grace, it's all part of the same whole. They have a lot to teach us, and without caring in the long term for ecological issues, we're all finished. So I really think that we need to honour Merlin as a Christian Druid, as a man who will bring us back into God's creation and help us get our priorities right.
Merlin has become part of a pagan revival in Britain. For some, he has come to represent an understanding of nature and the environment which 20th century science and logic cannot explain.
I think at the time that we're living in, he's a very, very powerful archetype. I don't believe he was a figure. I believe that Merlin is an energy in this land. If you look for a wizard in a tall pointy hat with stars, you're not going to find Merlin. Merlin's in the land, he's in the stars, he's in the space between the worlds.
When you do a fire walk, why it can be related to Merlin, to me, is because it's an initiation of magic. Merlin would have used many initiations within his own work and with the people that wish to learn from him. Fire is the teacher, and I'm here to learn and to become an ally with fire.
I think we have a yearning for magic in our lives. I think since the age of reason made us all into rationalists, we've had a yearning for something that isn't quite like that. And Merlin is very much a trickster figure who still plays with one. When I came here today, I noticed his 2 ravens overhead, which I've seen in so many Merlin sites. And it's as though this is a kind of archetypal figure of the magician, trickster, shaman that was much repressed and is now bobbed up again like this spring here in the mountains and wants us to drink of its wisdom once more.
There are dozens of legends describing the fate of Merlin. According to the Scottish story, one of Merlin the Wild's prophecies angered King Meldred, and, the day after he became a Christian, he was killed by the nobleman's irate shepherds.
The story goes that he was chased across these fields. As he ran across the field, being stoned by the shepherds, he fell into the Tweed and drowned. But as he did so, he impaled himself on a stake. And the extraordinary thing is that this means that he had what is called a triple death. And a triple death is attributed to ancient divinities like Odin and Lu, and even, of course, viewed from a certain perspective, Jesus Christ.
We can only speculate if Merlin the Wild was indeed the original source of the myth, which still today exercises a deep hold over our imaginations. But for nearly 1400 years, the legend of Merlin has survived as a lingering reminder of Britain's ancient pagan past.
There is the old prophecy that Merlin returns every 700 years. And in Scotland, they believe that after the first 700 years, he reappeared as Thomas the Rhymer. That's another story, but a lot of people know about Thomas the Rhymer and his prophecies. But it's interesting that we're just coming up now to another 700 years, 1400 years since Merlin died. Well, perhaps he's going to welcome us into the next millennium.